hello everyone. We're going to have a fireside chat, keynote, but first I wanted to introduce Jamar Doyle, my friend, who is our board vice president, and he is the executive director of Greater Collinwood Development Corporation, which is a nonprofit dedicated to equitable and inclusive neighborhood revitalization in 5 different neighborhoods in Cleveland's North Shore neighborhood area. He grew the organization, including bringing business investment dollars to the community, and he launched a $21 million redevelopment project of a vacant Longfellow School into 96 senior housing units. And I have to say, his voice is so important to our statewide conversation, and he is just getting started.
Thank you so much, Emily. That is very kind, and I have the pleasure to introduce my colleague, Emily Seibel, who is our esteemed president here at the Ohio CDC Association. Emily began working for Yellow Springs, Inc. In 2009 as a program manager, but became executive director in 2011. In this role, she has championed several successful projects, including affordable housing, multifamily rental, for sale, single family, new construction, and acquisition rehab. Y'all, she's busy. She's originally from Lawrence, Kansas, but she came to Yellow Springs to attend Antioch College, where she graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Social and Global Studies and a concentration in economics. Y'all, she's smart. As you all know, she serves as our board president, as I mentioned earlier, and she's actively involved in advocating for policies statewide that increase pass-through financial resources for all of our member organizations. Outside of this work, she's an awesome gardener, and more importantly, a loving and important and a friend, confidant, and just an all-around amazing person. So, Emily, so glad that you are up here on the stage with us.
Thanks, Jamar. Okay, so we are here today to have a very important conversation, and we are introducing Evelyn Burnett. And so Lisa said she wanted to sort of carry on the energy from last year's virtual conference, where Jamar and I each interviewed one of the keynotes. And rather than just have a presentation sort of taken to you or at you, we decided to have a more relaxed, intimate discussion, something that's more organic, and you'll have a chance to ask your questions too. So Evelyn Burnett is the real deal. She is a truth teller, a change maker, a thought leader. We are very fortunate to have her here, and she is a co-founder and CEO of the ThirdSpace Action Lab and ThirdSpace Café. The ThirdSpace Action Lab is a grassroots solutions studio dedicated to prototyping creative, place-based solutions to complex socioeconomic problems. Evelyn and her team are institutional and community organizers, activating third spaces to co-create more liberated spaces for people of color. Their goal is racially equitable systems change in pursuit of a real tangible sense of belonging.
So my job was to continue reading Evelyn's bio, but I am going to follow directions because she has said there is more than enough information in the packet, and we want to get right into the discussion because of how important this topic is. So I'm going to follow those instructions and jump right in to our first question, which is, you know, our whole framing around this is diversity, equity, inclusion, justice. It's an important moment that we find ourselves from our individual communities all the way out to, you know, the national, really even international conversations that are happening now around this conversation. So my first question to you, why is this conversation so important, and specifically why is it important to the state of Ohio and the organizations and the people sitting in this room?
Awesome. Can y'all hear me? Yes. Okay, well, first of all, good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I'm in my hometown, so I'm feeling really, really excited. And my mom and my dad and my little cousin are here, so I'm not nervous at all. And I had to make sure I was looking right so my mom didn't get all upset because she thinks my split is too high. But anyway, so we start all of our conversations at ThirdSpace Action Line with a soul check. And that's really important for us. Like, doesn't matter who we're talking about. We don't care if you're from PNC Bank or from the White House. We think it's really important to ground our conversations, checking in on the soul. And that's how I kind of answer your question about why we think this work is important. And a little bit about, there's some important questions here, a little bit about the Grassroots Solutions Studio thing. I'm sorry, I don't answer questions directly very well. But anyway, so I think that this work and this conversation is important because our society is deteriorating in front of our eyes in a lot of ways, right? We do this work around racial equity where we're trying to build people's awareness. And what we tell folks when they go through our trainings or they have conversations with us is once you see, you can't unsee. You know, once you hear, you can't unhear. Once you know, you can't unknow, right? And we often spend a lot of time kind of intellectualizing very simple questions like, why should we do this? Why should Ohio pay attention to a conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion, or racial equity and inclusion? And that's where the soul check kind of comes in for us, right? That like, we gotta get out of our heads and get back into our heart space as human beings, right? John Powell from the Othering and Belonging Institute, I know we'll talk more about this, reminds us that we need to broaden the circle of human concern, right? And I was listening, we were on a call with clients, and most of our days, y'all, are just really crazy, just back-to-back Zoom calls. And I heard my co-founder, Mordecai, say that on the call, and it kind of stopped me in my tracks. I hadn't heard him say that in a long time, this idea that we need to broaden the circle of human concern. And if we think about othering and belonging sort of as the poles, we have to make the us more expansive, right? Because we know right now it's such a polarized time. It's a lot of us and them, us and them, us and them. In most conversations we're in. So if we believe that we need to broaden the circle of human concern, then the answer to the question to me feels really clear, right? That we have a responsibility to face the brutal facts. And that's what we learned in the racial equity and inclusion trainings, but brought to us, you know, in our case by Racial Equity Institute, that once we see these facts, these brutal facts, we have a responsibility as practitioners, as professionals, as citizens, as residents, as community, as human beings to do something about it, right? To broaden that circle and to try to make a society that's equitable, racially equitable, fair, and just.
And I love what you said because I'm a person that believes the most powerful force is love. But a lot of times people forget that, right? Love never fails. And to your point, because we've lost sight of that, I feel that we're at this point of division. And we feel it in the communities that we serve, right? So how is it that for all of us, you know, a great number of us in this room are practitioners in community development, how can we begin to bridge that gap, have that conversation in a real, authentic, and then both impactful and actionable way in our communities, given what you said?
And I think that another way to say that would be, how do we ensure that community development serves as a tool for racial equity? And we keep that at the front and center. Because I think we were talking in our pre-call about how if we're not intentional about it, we will inadvertently end up forwarding the sort of going with the status quo of these incredibly inherently racist and oppressive systems that are fueling our economy and fueling public policy and many other areas. So how can we bring this lens to the front and center and ensure that community development serves as a tool for racial equity and bringing that lens in?
Yeah, so many thoughts. I'm going to try not to ramble. First of all, it's kind of like Nike, you just have to do it. You know, we have to find the courage and the bravery to do it. We have to, and what the doing it, I think for me, looks like is that we have to name that community development itself has been a racist system in many ways, whether that was intentional or unintentional, right? Intentions, we can talk about intentions later, but we have to acknowledge that the system itself is racist, right? We have to name that, and we have to name specifically how. We believe deeply that if we don't name it, you can't fix what you don't name, right? And that you just ignore. And there continue to be very racist policies, procedures, processes today. 2020, October. 2021. Is it 2021 now? Yeah. Not last year.
Who knows, Evelyn?
Right? But in 2021, we still have these racist policies, and we're still trying to build our awareness about, how do we fix it, right? But that's why we think that the awareness building is an important step. And community development can be a tool for a racially equitable and inclusive society. And while it is still a racist system, it is also, at the same time, doing really important things and has done really important things. But to your point, doing that intentionally is the difference, right? But we have to reckon with our history first to enable us to reckon with our present, to enable us to see the future that we want to see. We also have to have, I think importantly, some very tough conversations. It is always folks among us that don't believe, right? And it's not to kind of get into back and forth necessarily, but one of the things that we say in our work is that in liberated space, these are spaces of care and concern and love and self-respect and self-esteem, but they also are spaces that are inherently contentious because we're bringing such different backgrounds. I didn't grow up the way you grew up. I didn't grow up the way you grew up necessarily, right? And so those spaces are inherently contentious, but they're not intended to be combative, right? But we have to do some wrestling, we have to do some negotiating to be that tool for equity. But it's not easy, and I do think that it's grounded in also truth telling. We gotta tell the truth, right? We gotta tell the truth and kind of face some things that make us uncomfortable, right? So that we can actually make the system be the thing that we say we want it to be, and find out who ain't with it, because everybody ain't with it. We know that as well. So we gotta identify who those folks are, figure out how to organize them as well, or name that they're not with us, so we can sort of forge it.
That's really interesting in terms of how that translates then to a statewide organization. Because a lot of us work in communities where there is a real sense of this is how this community is. We know it's usually people that tend to look like us or have the same values of us. Like I live in a rural majority white community. And so to be able to have a statewide conversation, I think we have to create, as you said, a liberated space and bring that to the forefront and approach differences from a place of connection. Because I think it occurs to me that there's a lot of suppression and separation historically. Jamar, did you have a...
No, and thinking on that point, one of the sort of questions that I have is what can our organizations, and a lot of times CDCs, they occupy this place of power and privilege within our communities. We have access within our communities, but we also have small staffs and small resources. So a lot of times, we're tackling big things with the little resources that we have. And to your point, one, the field itself has had a checkered at best past in terms of what is community development, community improvement. If we're talking about urban renewal, is that Negro removal? So there is a history that has to be reckoned with regards to community development. And you said it earlier, so many policies that have been enacted through the course of the 20th century and now even into the 21st century have been detrimental to marginalized people and people of color. And we're small organizations with minimal resources. So how do we begin to, within our communities, make that change? because it's a system that's existed for centuries. And we have what we have to work with. And I think figuring out how we recognize our power, value our power, elevate that so that we can begin to make a change. But what do you see as being the role of organizations like community development corporations throughout Ohio to start to change when we're facing such a system that has existed for centuries and is so embedded in our culture and within our society and within just the way in which we live?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I'm a storyteller a little bit, so I just want to tell a quick story. So I was sitting out last night on, was it Phelps Street we were sitting on? Phelps? Yeah, okay. I'm asking my mom and dad. So we were sitting out on Phelps last night, and I was blown away. It was like not the Phelps Street that I remember growing up. We were sitting out on like the patio, they closed the street. And what was most striking was not just the physical development of the buildings, right, which that's important, but that it was a lot of diversity of people sitting outside, especially and importantly Black people. Black people out spending money, Black people out eating. And my dad said while we were eating, like this wasn't the Youngstown that he remembers in the 50s and 60s. He couldn't have done this growing up. And then they started pointing out the buildings. Like that was the side door we used to have to come in to like shop. These people are 70 years old. You know, these aren't 150-year-old people. You know, people that are 70 years old. It takes something like the Ohio CDC Association. And you know, they kind of summer in Cleveland and winter in Youngstown or something like that. But it takes something like this conference for us to like meet up and go downtown in a city that they've lived in for 70 years and have a meal, right? So I think to answer your question, the role of community development is not just about what do they call it, bricks and sticks. It's not just about the physical development. It's not just about restoring facades. It could be the role of the CDC to introduce a lifelong resident or reintroduce a lifelong resident to their city. To their city that they worked in. My mom's like, I worked in this building. I used to come in it, you know, and it's like, but you never sat and dined this way here. And these are not folks that are unexplored, right? These are folks that have been across the water, right? But we have a role and responsibility to reintroduce people to their cities in a welcoming and equitable way where people can feel a sense of belonging.
Can you expand on that just a little bit? When you say sense of belonging, you know, just looking through your slide deck earlier, there are some great, visuals on it, but can you talk about what that means so that it's not just sort of a performative statement, but it's felt? What does that mean to feel a real sense of belonging? What does that look like?
Oh, I should just leave it on Eddie Cloud for a minute. So I think what it means for me to feel a sense of belonging is that one, me and my parents can sit and have a meal and not feel concerned at all, right? That we're not worried if the waitresses or the wait staff think we ought to be there or not. Y'all know that in 2021, folks still don't feel welcome in a lot of spaces, right? So we're like, oh no, this space right here is not for us. I experience that in Cleveland all the time.
Yeah.
I go to restaurants in the city of Cleveland and I'm the only Black person. Or me and my partner are the only Black people dining in the restaurant. These are not the most expensive restaurants. These are not. So I see you want to get in, but like the belonging is a hard thing to describe, but you sort of know it when you feel it. When you feel it. And these things, again, don't show up well on our metrics. So I want to go back to your question for a second because community development also has a responsibility to redefine itself, right? Through our policies, through our procedures, through our practices, and through all of this community engagement that we've done for so long. We spend so much time talking to residents, right? And their complaints are real and valid, right? And so belonging to me would be that, like, this person is not making this complaint anymore. Because they have been heard, their issue has been addressed, right? and then they turn around and say, Jamar is amazing because he helped to address this issue that makes my community feel like it's mine, right? And so I think that we have a big responsibility to break some of the mold that we've kind of been in, just the blocking and tackling. I used to hear that a lot when I was in community, blocking and tackling. And that's important. But it's also important that we can help our residents and our community imagine, really imagine, right? When I think about like belonging, I sometimes have a hard time like imagining what a sense of belonging would look like in Youngstown. Yesterday was a snapshot, right? But we think that that's some of the hardest thing that we do in our work, is to imagine what does a racially equitable and racially inclusive society look like? What does a racially equitable and inclusive Ohio look like? What does it feel like? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? How do you move around it? Who's there? What are they doing? Right? And so we're trying to get folks to imagine that, because y'all know that that's a desired future state. We've never seen that in America.
And I want to hone in on that, because a lot of sometimes the work that we do begins to transform communities.
Yes.
And we're talking about a sense of belonging. What happens when someone who's lived in their community 10, 20, 50 years no longer feels like they belong because the dynamic of the community changes, either racially or economically, socially? How do we address that? And then also how do we address, and I can just speak for myself growing up east side of Cleveland, a community that, didn't have a lot of opportunity, didn't have, coffee shops or whatever you define as sort of the hip community. But then, once investment starts coming in, an investment that quite honestly doesn't look like me, now all of those resources come. And at the same time, the folks that have lived there are being pushed out. So this belonging question, I think, is important, because sometimes people can live in a community and then it changes and you feel that you no longer belong in the place you call home. What's our role to rectify that?
I think just to tie what you said and what you were saying together, there's a systemic piece of belonging. Invisible barriers and invisible opportunities. And so, how do we move beyond just focusing on grabbing at scarce resources and putting them into our community? How do we have a broader context that then translates into our institutions and our systems and the way that we look at land ownership and a lot of other, tangible pieces?
A lot of big questions there. Kind of on the what I heard was a displacement or gentrification question.
Yes.
And we think that gentrification is a really imprecise term. It's not necessarily like kind of getting at it, right? But we are also kind of gentrifying or displacing people in place, right? Everybody's not getting like pushed. It's not always the knock on your door, I want your thing, you get out. It's like we're kind of isolating people in their communities. We're bringing stuff that they can't afford because we haven't addressed the income and wealth gap, which we think is the value gap, right? The inherent belief that whiteness and white people matter more than everybody else. So another part of your question I think is really important is what you said, that investment that doesn't look like you. We gotta address that. If the money is all white or 99% white, right? If we do not address economic segregation and oppression, we're gonna repeat it. If I pick up a check, I kind of it's my table, right? And so to your question about policy and one of the things that we learned in the REI training is about the New Deal, right? And a lot of folks would argue that the New Deal was some of the most brilliant policy making in American history, but what folks don't know is 98% of it went to white folks. 98% of it went to white folks, y'all. So when folks in Youngstown, you went and bought a house on Crandall Park because your grandfather went to the war and came back and took advantage of the GI Bill, right? He pulled himself up by his bootstraps. And 98% of that went to one group of people, right? And the legacy of that history lives with us today in our housing values. The last time I checked on my parents' house on the east side of Youngstown, McGuffey Road, was the last appraisal, $11,000, $10,000? What's that do for our family, right? That makes us start behind the starting line all the time. So today we have an opportunity. We've got all these ARPA and R dollars coming. Where are they going? We've already got the early reports about where PPP money went and EIDL money went, right? Like we're still not concentrating resources in any equitable way at all, right? We keep looking at the same sort of problems and applying the same treatment to the problems. I grew up in a quasi-government. Dad worked at GM, my mom worked at the state, so that means we were like pretty solidly middle class for Youngstown. But you know, when I was going into the nonprofit world, I thought it was like taking a vow of poverty, sort of. I did. And right? And thank God I had parents who were able to put me through school without any student debt. Shouts out to y'all for that. Like, literally. And you know what that means for any family, regardless of race, to finish a master's degree with no debt and just start at the start line? To just start at the start line, right? We need more people to be able to start at the start line through the starting line, through our policy making, through the distribution of our resources, through our programmatic interventions. We have to apply that race lens to everything, right? And I know that makes people feel uncomfortable because all of us want to live in this sort of race-neutral society. We want to, you know, remember when Barack Obama got elected, we were all like, oh, you know, it's post-racial. It's not at all, right? And so we are continuing to kind of repeat the sins of the past, and we really have to break that. And what worries me a lot of days is that we keep making that mistake over and over. Can I just show you one thing really quick? So this slide here is really interesting. My co-founder, I created this when we were trying to kind of think about your question, a similar part of your question. And when we say stuff to people like you should pull yourself up by your bootstraps, we gotta, you know, and it's all the tropes, like, well, who had on boots and all these sorts of things. This is another way of thinking about that. You see all these corporations that were created when segregation was legal and sanctioned by the federal government. So think about if your aunt or your uncle or your grandfather, well, probably not your aunt, probably your grandfather or your uncle, worked at any of these places. It was legal to segregate. You do not have to hire a black person, a brown person, or a woman, necessarily, for all this time. So we've only been in a legally segregated society for about 50 or 60 years. And we know how long practice lags behind policy. You can put in a policy today, it takes a long time for folks to adhere to the policy. And then you've got to like enforce the policy and make sure people understand the consequences if you don't follow the policy, right? So we don't have a lot of language and grounding in a post-segregated society that is segregated and sanctioned by the federal government. And so I believe, and for those of you that haven't read Richard Rothstein's work, you should definitely check it out among many other books that we could recommend. But that's what he pointed out for us, right? That there was de jure segregation, there is a role for the federal government. There is a role for the state of Ohio. There is a role for Mahoning County, Cuyahoga County, and every other, 88 counties in Ohio? Is that right? Somebody should, 88 counties?
Yes, 88 counties.
There's a role for every single one of those counties, including the ones that feel like they don't have to deal with race because there are no people of color and no black people there. Everybody was complicit, so there is like a role. Because if a black person or if a brown person chose to move to your community, you should have policies in place to make sure that they feel a sense of belonging as well.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And I have to say that this is such a powerful slide because I hadn't even thought about it in those terms too. How many of our institutions that we think of as beloved institutions, right, were founded in an era of either Jim Crow or even slavery. And to your point, how long those patterns exist afterwards. So
And we can look at the leadership of these organizations, right? The executives of these organizations, it's very few, it's very, 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 very little diversity of any kind, right? And so another answer to your question is like, we can actually address diversity. Even before we get to the racial equity, we're still not seeing the diversity in our institutions and organizations that we need to see. And we're seeing it a little bit more in some CDCs, right? You're executive director, but are the resources that you're receiving as the director, as the Black director of a board, sort of consumerate and equitable with that of others? We can get those numbers easily, right? We're having that conversation in Cleveland. It's very uncomfortable for people.
Right. No, and I think that's exactly it. Questions from the, I see you looking. So no, I think that's important because how do we distribute resources, especially when there is this legacy that exists and these patterns are continuing, and you see it in the maps that produce and bear out the data. So even though technically redlining is illegal, when you look, you still see property values on the east side, majority Black, are way lower and have not seen the investment and the uptick that is seen on the west side, which is more majority white. And then when you layer on top of it, that's where health disparities are, income disparities are, lower educational attainment. It just all, thank you. There are the maps exactly that talk about exactly what I'm talking about. And this is what we're fighting. This is literally what we're fighting.
And now you can, I mean, we have the data now to tie life expectancy to zip code. And I encourage everybody to look it up and start making those comparisons. I think that's very powerful, astounding, and quite illuminating that, you know, like where I live, my life expectancy is 13 years longer than our neighbors 13 miles down the road. And that's wrong. And I think as a society, I just keep coming back to this idea that there is a lot of suppression and separation of all people. You know, I mean, so we're really all in this together, and if we can find the points of connection in terms of not only economic policies, but also then bringing this racial equity lens to the forefront. I think there's a real overlap there, and as a country, and certainly as a state, we're challenged in that conversation. I think it's a very difficult and complex, you know, discussion, and so I think we're looking to you for just help break it down a little bit.
I'm glad you raised that because you kind of asked that earlier and I didn't answer it, so I want to answer it now. One of the I think really dangerous outcomes of our inability or resistance to talking about race is it obscures what's happening to all of us. Right? So you go through Racial Equity Institute's training, you see all of these charts and graphs and maps and things like that. And one of the profound things and really kind of infuriating things that every time I look at this data is that there's one consistent pattern, always. And that is that white is always on the top and Black is always on the bottom. And other racial groups kind of toggle throughout depending on which system we're talking about, right? And that's infuriating by itself. But what you can miss is that it doesn't mean that white is doing well in the category. It's just that Black and white are the bookends. So you think about infant mortality. Are y'all familiar with these infant mortality stats in America?
Oh yeah.
They're some of the worst in Cuyahoga County. You know where they're the worst in Cuyahoga County? The 6 neighborhoods that surround Cleveland Clinic, University Hospital, Case Western Reserve University, and that's the case in a lot of cities because that's where the poverty is concentrated. Does that mean there's not white poverty in the city of Cleveland? That's not what it means at all. It means like the concept, like, and we throw around these terms, we don't understand things like disparities. What does that mean? It just means that this group is having a worse outcome systemically than this group. But it doesn't mean that this group is doing well. So I sit I'm the board chair of an organization called Birthing Beautiful Communities. It's a Black doula collective. You know what I spend more time defending, or what I spend most of my time on? Defending why we have Black doulas. Not raising money, like I should be as the board chair. I do a little bit of that. But I defend why we need Black doulas in this organization. But when you look at the stats, You know, there's 14 to 1 stats. I'm a 37-year-old unmarried Black woman. So looking at a stat about the likelihood of somebody like me that's college educated and blah, 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 you know, and not only the risk to me having a baby, but the maternal morbidity stats are terrible as well. So I could lose my own life trying to have a baby in America in 2021. But you know what's crazy? White women are having really bad outcomes too, right? So if we're not looking at the data and interpreting it properly, then we kind of say like, oh, well, that's that group I don't really care about anyway because they make bad choices and they eat too much fried chicken and they're lazy and they do this and they do that, and, you know, and they don't take their prenatal medicine and they don't care about their kids, right? Those are the stereotypes that we hold about people. Y'all have to understand, before some of this data came out a few years ago about infant mortality and maternal morbidity, that is what people said, that is what doctors say today about why Black women are experiencing the outcomes we're experiencing. And you know what doctors say about low-income white women? Same thing, right? So like, we have to, again, if we're thinking about broadening the circle of human concern and broadening the us, then I see your suffering the same way as I see Jamar suffering. Because we're all suffering. And Martin Luther King and so many others told us this 60 years ago. You want to keep these people oppressed, keep them fighting each other. Keep them fighting each other. Don't let them see their common interests. And everything will be fine. The elites, we can keep our money, we can keep them over there and us over here. And we keep accepting this lie. And the lie is growing in these polarized times. And so I think I got away from your question again, but I think that we really have to kind of dig deeper and have some tougher conversations and hear each other's stories, right? Like we have to rehumanize ourselves to each other. And I do think that is another very important role, back to your question, for community development, to make liberated space for people to get to know each other again, or get to know each other, period, so that we can see our common interests in this thing. And that is the role, we talked about this on our pre-call, the role of organizing and mobilizing, and why we, as ThirdSpace Action Lab, are community and institutional organizers, because we have to organize our institutions as well, right?
I think that is a really, really important point because, you know, having the conversation is important, having intention is important, but we're connected to these systems that go all the way back to, you know, colonial times, go all the way back to, you know, the failed, broken promises after slavery ended of 40 acres and a mule. You know, all of this, there's so much systemic legacy built into, you know, our financial institutions, built into the way that where people live and what resources they have access to, and then historically, the victims of oppression being blamed and not, you know, sort of the dominant culture say you can't trust your own experience. You're not the expert of your experience. And so how do we as community development practitioners look beyond our own organization, sticks and bricks, metrics, you know, spin it in the hamster wheel and take a step back and look at how we can address some of these larger institutional and systemic issues around particularly racial equity and inclusion.
I mean, this is going to feel recycled, but we have to actually look, right? Like it's right in front of us, right in front of us. You know, you go to nice spaces, you see a common pattern. And even if you interrogate what's a nice space, what's a nice neighborhood, right? Like common pattern. Even the way that we talk about community development has to change its lexicon. It really has to do some hard work around how we describe things, good and bad, high performing, and you know, that's what got me kicked out of community development. I was like, wait. What is the rubric that we're using here to evaluate success? What Jamar's got to do on the east side of Cleveland looks different than what they had to do in Detroit Shoreway.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and
sorry, Detroit Shoreway people.
No, Jamar and I talk about that a lot though, because like I work in a community stabilization environment where, You know, we are, you know, from the rubric of success, we're a very high opportunity community, and yet we're displacing people right and left. Over half of the renters are housing cost burden, and so how do we remove land from the speculative market so that it benefits the community forever? That's what we're doing. That's a really different set of circumstances from where you're working, Jamar, and I know we talk about that a lot. And so
exactly, and I love what you said, Evelyn, because it really, the lexicon that we use in this industry can be damaging to communities that we're trying to help. You know, because again, there are, and you're right, you feel it. This is a, you know, good quote unquote community versus this isn't. And you know, we talk about that even in, you know, urban planning schools. They talk about, you know, broken windows theory, and you know, when is that point that you know, you kind of turn around because this neighborhood doesn't feel comfortable anymore. Well, what does that say for the people that live there, for the people that work there? There are humans that their lives happen within that space, and it still is a great community. You know, Glenville didn't become great because investment came. Glenville was a great community when I was growing up. You know, in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. It's not just because it's now Circle North and, you know, adjacent to University Circle. So I think, to your point, how do we talk about these communities? And then also, how do resources get talked about? You know, and I want to go back to something you said pertaining to, you know, coming out of World War II, and, you know, if you're able to get that GI Bill, you could pull yourself up from your bootstraps, right? You were self-made. Well, my granddad got that GI Bill. He bought in Glenville. His property values didn't go up because that neighborhood was redlined.
Right.
So he couldn't afford to send his kids to college. So he did what he was supposed to do. He bought a house that was supposed to build equity, but it was on the wrong side of the tracks. And he couldn't move anywhere else because that was not allowed, going back to that map earlier. So, you know, again, when we think about that, you can, on one hand, there's help, like mortgages, and those are what we call sort of the good money, but then if someone needs assistance, that's bad money. We want to look down on the quote-unquote welfare queen, which we know that that's a whole made-up situation, but those kind of stories still get told, and then that begins to create a narrative about our communities that is untrue. So it's not just the communities themselves, but even the way in which we talk about financing and the way in which we help people divides people. Because some people get help that this is a positive factor, then other types of assistance and help we look at as being a negative, and we have to change that kind of conversation.
I mean, it sounds like you're advocating for being very human-centered as we reevaluate and reimagine the possibilities of what our institutions could look like. And so, how could that translate into how we measure our own success in the field of community development?
A lot of questions and points there. I had put up a slide about our sort of praxis, because this language work is important because it's connected to narrative. And for those of you that have participated in Racial Equity Institute's groundwater workshop, it's this like kind of simple metaphor where they're talking about if you keep going out to the same body of water or even different bodies of water, you keep seeing these fish, floating belly up dead. It's not the fish, even though a lot of our approaches to our work in government and nonprofit, even the private sector, is we're like, what's wrong with the fish?
It's a lazy fish.
It's a lazy fish. The fish ate too much, right?
The fish made bad choices.
The fish made bad choices. Right? But you keep looking body of water, the same type of fish are belly up dead. And I'm not saying the fish are just black, right? But just the same fish. And so then you say, like, all right, I got to look at the water. Well, it's different bodies of water. It's like Michigan and Huron and way out here in Tacoma. And then you have to address the groundwater. And so what that has meant for us in our work, and I have to tell you all, I can kind of sell water to a well. It took me a really long time to understand this metaphor. Like I sort of understood it theoretically, but I didn't understand what it meant in practice. And it finally clicked for me. I'm sure my partner Mordecai helped it kind of make sense for me. But to me, and this kind of goes back to one of your earlier questions, if we are actually addressing, if we are looking honestly and with humility at our racial history and the legacy of our history and dealing with narrative, little Tamir Rice doesn't get shot in heart in 2 seconds, in less than 2 seconds, right? Like we fundamentally look at communities differently. We look at people differently. I don't know how that's going to show up in Metro. You know, I don't. I know that the narrative that we hold about Glenville, about Black spaces, one of the things that I put up is Black spaces political. If we don't reckon with what that means and why that is, you know, after the uprising last summer, I was out and I was with the head of the NAACP in Cleveland. I was trying to behave. I didn't want my mom and dad to get, you know, excited. And the reporter like puts this mic in our face and like, what is it that you want white people to do? What should we do? And I'm like, leave us alone. Leave us alone. Right? Like we just when I think about like what is my imagination, my most radical imagination, I want to be regular. Right? I want to get up, go to work, come home. I don't want my space to be political. I just want to be regular. When you go through the Racial Equity Institute's 2-day training, they do an exercise towards the end often. They go around, they ask everybody, what do you like about being? And the first part of the exercise is hard as, you know, white folks are like, well, no, I'm not white, I'm Italian. I'm in Youngstown. I'm Italian. Or I'm Irish, you know. And so you finally like, okay. And, you know, some of the Black folks are like, well, I'm, you know, part Cherokee. And like, okay, all right. And so you get, right, and then you go around and you ask everybody, and they're putting it on the board, what people like about being Black, what people like about being Asian, what people like about being Native American if they're in one, what people like about being white. The other thing the white folks say is like, I don't like the question, because we can do that too. I don't really like this question. Finally, folks start to answer. Anybody know what the #1 answer is for white folks? What they like about being white? If you've gone, don't say it. #1 answer is I never thought about it. I never thought about it. And so when we're doing our organizing work such shoulder to shoulder, because what you ain't gonna hear from the Black or the brown groups is that you never thought about being Black, right? And so again, like when we're thinking about metrics and we're thinking about our practices and our policies, folks have to just like kind of consider, what is your power? What is your privilege? What is your advantage? You know, Racial Equity Institute doesn't use the term privilege too much because you're hard-pressed to go down into what they used to call the monkey's nest here in Youngstown, right? And talk to some white folks that are making median wages of below poverty and tell them they have privilege. If I was them, you wouldn't tell me I have privilege, right? But, real quick, but the whiteness gives an advantage that you don't have to do anything to have. You don't have to do anything at all to have it, right? And so that's where we have to broaden, we have to push the conversation further than what makes us comfortable. Is it time for questions from other people?
Well, yeah, so that was, I think, very helpful, and it comes back to the othering and belonging, right? Because when you were saying that, what is the #1 answer, I thought, like the first thing that occurred for me, and I haven't been through the training, is, well, when I wander around, I'm not getting 1,000 pets a day, and I don't have to worry when I go here or there, and that is a privilege. But I like that language, that framework of an advantage, because there, like as you said earlier, there are a lot of white people struggling too. I mean, the majority of recipients of these benefit programs, and so how can we create that point of connection? So. We only have about 10 minutes left, and so we do want to take a few questions, but before that, we were wondering if you had a final vision, a final aspiration, something to leave us with to imagine something new.
Well, I started to say it. I mean, my vision is that we live in a society where everybody just has a marriage, right? Or that none of us do, right? We can just be. That's inherently in ThirdSpace, this idea that you have first place and second place in ThirdSpace, and this space of belonging for everyone that's free and accessible and all. You know, we in my vision for the world I want to live in, we don't have to spend our community development time debating accessibility, affordability, right? Like we do it in robust and profound ways that are tangible to people because they feel it and they live it every day, right? And that belonging is no longer an abstract sort of idea, right? But one that a lot of people can articulate easily because they know it, but not in a society where it feels like an academic exercise because so many people don't feel it. No, and I think the other part is that we just kind of think and find courage to have these conversations that are really icky and uncomfortable, right? But that allow us to face the brutal facts that are right in front of us, to kind of live in the world that we want to live in.
It just, I know we're going to take questions, but I just have to say, I love what you just said about courage, because the root of the word courage is heartfelt. Be courageous is to be heartfelt. And so, while these conversations can be uncomfortable, we are also leading with our hearts. And that comes back to belonging, which then comes back to love, which is how we started out this whole conversation. So, with that, why don't we take some questions from folks online or from folks in the room?
There's one up here. It's open. We have one online. They need to introduce it. They're going to need this.
We have a plan for this, but I don't remember what it is.
She needs to say on the microphone.
All right.
Question online.
Take the question, tell them through the mic that we'll take the question online for Marilyn Burns.
You're supposed to say.
Good morning, hello. Can you hear me? Good morning, Ms. Burnett. It's so good to hear you. This conversation was so awesome to me. But I have a conversation. You were talking a great deal about Community Development Corporation. And I'm very involved with one here in Cleveland. And I just want to say that for me, when we talk about community development corporations and getting community engagement, involvement, I think it takes a whole lot to do with the spirit of the community. If the spirit is not fed, first of all, then how is the involvement and how is the work of community development corporations going to be ever successful? Because we talk about residents and neighbors in our communities, and if their spirits are not fed first, then how is anything supposed to be built? I believe that the spirit is the foundation of everything that we do in life. And what can you suggest that we can do as far as reviving, restoring the spirit of our community in order for our community development corporations to be successful?
That's my girl, Ms. Burns. And I would lift up Ms. Burns as an example of what community development needs to do. Ms. Burns sends me a motivation every single morning. I'm not joking, every morning. Her and a friend of mine, Evelyn, they send me something every single morning. And I think if we were pouring into each other in those big and seemingly small ways, you know, I can almost set my clock in the morning to my text from Evan and Ms. Burns. Like, I know I'm running late if I haven't, or something ain't right if I haven't. Really, right? And these messages matter a lot. These little bits of motivation when my dad says hi back to me in the morning, right? These small acts that seem like small acts are really important when you feel like you're in a battle every day, right? And CDCs can adopt more of that. And you really spoke about courage in a beautiful way. I believe in Linda Warren, who's a community development giant in Cleveland, and really, maybe nationally, reminds me all the time that we operate from two places, fear and love, right? And we've got to start operating from a place of love more. We've got to put these metrics and all of this stuff in its right place, and really kind of go deeper and commit more to Ms. Burns' point about feeding the community's souls as well. right? You talked about there's so much, and I watch you do it every day. We have to feed people differently. We have to buck some of the pressures from our funders and love the banks, right? But like that's something else that it can feed the soul if we address some of the wrongs and the harms that people are experiencing every day. And that requires us to speak up. And so you can speak up by whispering in someone's ear and telling them like keep going, or you can speak up by saying this is what we need the banks to do to address the impacts of redlining in our communities. Thank you, Ms. Burns. I'm so glad that she was able to make it.
I love that. I'm hearing put the human back in humanity.
Yes.
Because we've treated each other so terribly throughout history. So I love that. Feed the soul and make sure that we're treating all of humanity as humans.
Ooh, child. I'll try to be disciplined. Yeah, we are tired. People of color are getting quite fatigued needing to educate white people. I don't know how else to put it. And I think some days you have it in you and some days you don't. I know that's how I feel. Like some days I can go really deep and I've got all the patience and empathy in me. And other days I'm like, please go take a look at any of these resources that we've been sharing for forever. But I will say, white folks also have to do some work, and I do think that this is another community development imperative. Caucusing is powerful. Caucusing is not about division. Caucusing is being with people where you can like have real conversation and not put the labor of your lack of understanding on someone else, right? And that's often what I'm kind of hearing you say. I know it's certainly my experience is that I have to educate you, not you, but like educate you. Right? But really, this is what a lot of black folks and brown folks are experiencing in their workplaces and in community development, right? Where we have to educate you, keep you comfortable for our safety, right? When I was working at Cleveland Neighborhood Partners, I'll never forget it, my mom was there. I asked her, I said, you know, white women's comfort, or black women's safety often depends on white women's comfort. And the white woman in the front of the audience was irate, and she raised her hand and she said, you know, that she disputes that. Then she said something about Emmett Till, and I'm like, girl, please don't make me black out here. And then the conversation moves on, just like it was a form, just like this. And then she raises her hand again and she says, your boss is Joel Ratner, right? And I said, yeah. And she said, and your board chair, Brian Zimmerman, right? Yeah. That's terrifying enough, right? Do y'all know the end of the story? She called him. Both of them. And I was like, man, I couldn't have set this up any better, right? and that's unfortunate, but that's what we're experiencing a lot, is that, you know, I don't have a better answer. Sometimes you got it and sometimes you don't. But we do, part of the courage work and the like will work is like, yeah, white folks, I gotta step up and like take some of the load as well, right? And have some conversations with each other and be mindful of the burden that you are putting on people every day that have to show up in a certain way just to keep their jobs. Right?
And can I just think in some ways, and we'll get to the next question, just expand on that, because I think to your point, you know, and I think, you know, we've talked about sort of the black and white, but that can also be extrapolated to, you know, other, you know, marginalized folks. So that could be LGBTQ, that could be Latinx, that could be Asian, that could be, you know, a number of others where, you know, and we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. So, you know, I don't want to think that this has solely been black and white. We have a lot of the data and sort of experience through that, but certainly exactly what you're saying. And I think I can say, as not just a member of the black community, but also a member of the LGBTQ community, yes, it's the same thing. You get exhausted explaining certain things. So it's thinking through that conversation on a number of different levels, because we're trying to your point, recognize everyone is human and put that human back into humanity and lead with love, so that we can begin to really address all of these systemic things, this groundwater, so that we can really change the makeup of that lake.
And there's more power together.
Absolutely.
To have a say in our collective destiny, without a doubt. Yeah. Okay, I think there was one more question, then we have to wrap up. I think you were standing up earlier.
That's my vista.
I was about to say, is he with you? We joke that when people are like, what's a grassroots solution studio? We joke, although we're not joking that much, that we're like, if McKinsey and Company, it's like one of the oldest consulting firms in the country, and P-Funk had a soulful biracial baby. That's the ThirdSpace action plan. And y'all know what P-Funk says. Free your mind and your behind will follow, right? So I think that's how I would answer your question. Like, emancipation is a profound ideal, right? And you kind of answered your question. Like, if we stay economically indebted to organizations that do us wrong. And you know, I'm partnering with the Cleveland Clinic. I have decided for today that I need to be in the room. I need to be at the table. And that can be tough, because sometimes you're in the room when you feel like you're on the menu. Y'all ever had that? That's right. That's a weird space to be in, where you're like, ooh, man, am I selling the whole community down the river for this $10,000 grant? Right? So we do have to kind of interrogate, strike some better deals, have some harder negotiations with these folks. And I think to your point, we got to turn some money away. Yeah. It's just that simple. Like, we just got to turn some money away. We got to have more businesses. ThirdSpace Action Lab is not a nonprofit. at all, y'all, because we trying to get this money, because I think that we have to continue to go to other folks and ask them for our emancipation and liberation. That has not served us very well. Right, so we have to really build our economic power as a part of our liberation and emancipation as well. But I'm gonna make sure I get your information, because I think you got some ideas as well. Thank you. I think we're supposed to wrap up.
Yeah, I think we're over time, but,
I see the look, man.
there's so I think we all have like 100 things we want to say, and we're going to have lunch now, so you're going to have an opportunity to talk with people and further this conversation. This is the beginning, not the end, certainly, and Evelyn, you are just so amazing and inspiring, and I think we all learned a lot.